So as a lay chaplain from 2002 to 2016, I officiated around 500 weddings. And many of those weddings, of course, have faded from my memory, but not all. There's quite a few I remember. But the one that has maybe the most vivid memory for me was my very first wedding back in 2002. The reason it's still vivid in my memory is because I was so damn nervous. It was for a young couple in their 20s up at the golf club in Grand Bend. My first wedding. The bride's aunt was a Unitarian in Toronto, and she had suggested to her that maybe she could check out the Unitarian Fellowship to see if they had a lay chaplain who could officiate. So they contacted me, and I agreed to do the wedding. They said, just keep it short, very short. I said, wonderful, it's my first wedding. I'd love to keep it short. So it was a wonderful, hot, sunny day in August 2002. It was complicated by the fact that a few weeks earlier I had fallen badly and damaged my left knee, so I was using a crutch to walk. And then, so the bride comes up the aisle, outdoor wedding. It was hot. The bride came up the aisle with her father, and everything was fine. Everyone stood as the bride came up with her father. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of forgetting to tell everyone to sit down then. So people were standing and some were sitting down and not knowing what to do, but I just carried on with the ceremony. Anyway, apart from that, it went well. I got through it. It was a success, and the couple, Paul and Sarah, gave me this nice little candle snuffer in appreciation. She knew that Unitarians can always use these. So being a lay chaplain has been such a wonderful experience for me over the years. And first of all, I want to begin by expressing gratitude. First of all, gratitude to the fellowship here for appointing me as a lay chaplain. And also thanks to the Lay Chaplaincy Committee that was formed to oversee the program at our fellowship. Anne became, not initially, but she did become the chair of the committee. And I want to thank Anne for all her hard work and guidance over the years. And Anne also became a member of the Canadian Unitarian Council, CUC, Lay Chaplaincy East Committee. There are two, one for Western Canada and one for Ontario and Eastern Canada. And Anne eventually became the chair of that committee. So she has served lay chaplaincy both for this fellowship and for the CUC in half of Canada for many years. Thank you, Anne. Secondly, I want to thank all the couples I married and the families I served as a funeral memorial service officiant for putting their trust in me. Big responsibility to be a lay chaplain, and it was a great honor to serve everyone over the years. And thirdly, not least, I want to thank my wife Dorothy for all her love, support, and encouragement, and patience and sacrifice. When I disappeared on Saturday to do a wedding or two, she never complained and was always supportive. Yeah, lay chaplaincy, being a lay chaplain was one of the most meaningful and fulfilling experiences of my life. So some of the newer members and friends may not be familiar with the lay chaplaincy program. So I'd just like to back up a little bit, give you a bit of background. The lay chaplaincy program was established in 1970 by the Canadian Unitarian Council, CUC. And the reason they did that is because Unitarian ministers were being called all the time to perform weddings and some funeral services. And so there weren't enough Unitarian ministers to fulfill all the demand. So the Lay Chaplaincy Committee was established. So why was there such a demand for Unitarian ministers? Well, to take weddings back then, the 60s, the 70s, most couples would only have two choices. You could either get married in the church, which was what a lot of couples did. It's what I did in Northern Ireland when I got married in the church. So a church is always going to be a religious service. Or you would go to a city hall and have a rather short bureaucratic ceremony to make you officially married. So couples were looking for something more, something different. They wanted more choice. And so Unitarians filled that role. We were pioneers. The Unitarian Church was pioneers in that regard. We offered non-traditional ceremonies, non-religious ceremonies. It was what the couples and what the families wanted. And there was such a growing demand for that. This is a brochure that came out at the time. It said the lay chaplaincy program is to promote Unitarian values by four ways. One, to provide Unitarian rites of passage for members of the congregation, obviously, and then to serve the wider community by performing weddings, particularly in cases of people from different faiths or backgrounds, memorial services, child dedications, and other rites of passage. Number 3, assisting non-Unitarians to connect with our congregations. And number 4, enhancing the spiritual growth and development of members who serve as lay chaplains. So you're not going to remember everything I share today, but I will try and highlight some key points. So that's key point number 1, is that we were pioneers in offering what we do to the Canadian public. And the program has been very successful. Although I have to say now the demand for our wedding services has really dropped off because there are so many wedding companies now in Canada offering these kinds of ceremonies. So they're now much more widely available. But not when I started to be a lay chaplain. So I joined this fellowship in 1996, and I became president in 1998, 99, and 2000. So I was always curious about lay chaplaincy when I found out about it after joining. And so when I was president in 1999, I decided I would find out more about it. I traveled to St. Catharines to participate in a lay chaplaincy training program. These were for new lay chaplains and also people like me who were just curious about what it was all about. And I returned from that weekend workshop with great enthusiasm. And I came back to Sarnia here, told people, just what a wonderful thing it would be to have a lay chaplain. And I wasn't ready to be a lay chaplain because I was still working full-time in the lab at the hospital. So Wendy Starr became our first lay chaplain in 2000. And then Kathleen McKay, Sharon's daughter, was also appointed a lay chaplain that year. By the end of, in 2002 then, Sharon's daughter Kathleen moved to Toronto. So I thought, well, I had the opportunity to take an early retirement at the hospital, which I said I would do in April 2003. And so I said, well, maybe this is the time for me to step up and be a lay chaplain. And so in 2002, I was established or installed here as a lay chaplain. And then some years later, Bill Franks became our third lay chaplain. So at one time, we had 3 lay chaplains. And Anne maybe can confirm this, but we may have been possibly the only Unitarian congregation in Canada with 3 lay chaplains. And we were quite busy at that time, doing weddings and some funeral memorial services. And then Wendy retired eventually, and then Bill stepped down for health reasons, and that left me as the only lay chaplain until Steve eventually decided he would jump into the role, and that was wonderful. That gave me the opportunity then to step down as a lay chaplain and put it in Steve's good hands. However, Steve wanted to focus on officiating weddings, so I decided I would continue as a celebrant to perform funeral and memorial services, independent celebrant performing funeral memorial services after I stepped down as lay chaplain, which I did up until the end of last year. So I'm only doing it now for families who specifically approach me and ask me to do that. So I'd like to share some memories, experiences of my time as a lay chaplain. The gift of lay chaplaincy, it certainly was a great gift, and a labor of love. As I said, my first wedding was in August 2002. I did 4 more weddings that year before the end of 2002. The next year, 2003, I officiated 30 weddings. Incredible. 10 of those weddings were for gay and lesbian couples. So 1/3 of the weddings I did in 2003 were for gay and lesbian couples. That was because Ontario legalized same-sex marriage in July 2003, which was then followed by legalization across Canada in 2005. But many of the weddings I did, initial same-sex weddings I did, were for American couples who took advantage of the fact that they could now get married legally, and if they came to Canada, and many of them did. The first wedding, the first marriage I did for a gay couple was a couple from California. On the July long weekend, they came up to Michigan to visit their family. So they nipped across the border, got their marriage license, and I did their ceremony down at the waterfront. There just happened to be a reporter from the Sarnia Observer walking past, and he ended up doing a story on the front page of Monday's paper, Sarnia's first gay marriage. Great publicity for the fellowship. And the second, a few weeks later, the second same-sex marriage I did was for a gay couple from Chicago. And one of them was a Unitarian minister. The Unitarian minister and his partner came to Sarnia, and they were married right here in this room. That was my second same-sex marriage. Unfortunately, they only brought 1 witness with them, and legally you have to have 2 witnesses. So I asked my daughter to be the witness for their wedding. So that was, these were great experiences. And that's key point number 2, is that we offered social justice to gay and lesbian couples. We were the first church in Sarnia to do that, to perform same-sex marriages. So key point, social justice. And it was wonderful. These people had been denied the right to marry for so long. And to be able to give them that privilege was such an enriching experience for me as a lay chaplain. So also in April that year, 2003, I retired from the hospital, and in May I traveled out to Winnipeg for the Canadian Unitarian Council annual meeting. And there I met other lay chaplains from across Canada, and we participated in some workshops, which was wonderful. After the CUC meeting ended, I then hopped on a plane and flew to Vancouver because I had registered to take additional training as a celebrant. This was a weekend training dedicated solely to doing funeral and memorial services. And this is training that Wendy Starr had taken earlier in Toronto and had spoken very highly of it. So I was very passionate about doing funeral and memorial services. So I wanted to attend this course in Vancouver. These celebrant training courses were being offered across North America by Doug Manning and his daughter Glenda Stansbury, who are from Oklahoma, and they're still doing it today. And Doug was a former minister, a Baptist minister. He gave up the ministry, he became a funeral director, and then he got to see both sides of the story. He got to see that families were not being served well by the clergy, and he said he found out about celebrants from Australia, where it started, and he said, we got to bring this to North America. So he started a program, and his daughter is still continuing that training all across North America today. Doug Manning wrote a book called The Funeral, and this is what he said. He said, the clergy are novices at best and have very little idea what a funeral should be. It is no wonder we are producing some very bad funerals. So I know myself, I've been to many funerals where you hear the same thing again and again. We call it cookie cutter funerals. The name of the deceased may not even be mentioned or mentioned very rarely, but it's all about prayers and hymns and readings. And Doug Manning realized, this can't go on. We got to train people to do funerals properly. So I was very passionate because I agreed with him totally. And the philosophy of the Unitarian Lay Chaplains is to meet the needs of the family. Simple as that. And there's absolutely no greater feeling of satisfaction when I perform a funeral or memorial service than driving home afterwards, knowing that the family appreciated what I did and thanked me most sincerely for it. It is a wonderful feeling to know that you give them what they wanted to honor their loved one. So, just a little bit of humor. A lay chaplain was once asked, well, why do you like doing funerals better than weddings? And the lay chaplain answered, well, a funeral is the end of suffering. A wedding is the beginning. A wedding is the beginning. That wasn't me, by the way. That was somebody else. But when I meet with the family, find out what they want, then I go home and I prepare the service, which takes me, quite a while. But I'm always conscious of the words of Maya Angelou, the African-American poet and writer. And this is what she said, and I always keep this in the back of my mind. She said, people may forget what you said. People may forget what you did. But they will never forget how you made them feel. And that's the summary. That's it right there in a nutshell. You want to leave, you want to go home knowing that you met their needs and they felt that their needs were met and they appreciated it. So, as I said, I did my first wedding in August 2002. I did many more. It wasn't until the end of 2003 that I had the opportunity to do a memorial service. And that was for Nora Harrington, who was the mother of Bev McDougall, who used to be the executive director here and city councillor. Bev approached me and said, Allan, would you consider driving to Stratford to do my mother's memorial service? And so I did. And it went well. Bev and the family appreciated it. But my first funeral in Sarnia was a couple of months later, January 2004. And I got a call from Grant Mackenzie at Mackenzie Blundy, and he had seen Wendy perform services. He had encouraged her to do the celebrant training, so he knew what we could do. So Wendy wasn't available for this service, so Grant called me and said, Allan, I need you for this service. It was for a 36-year-old man who dropped dead one Saturday night at home in Toronto. Just dropped dead. He had some kind of heart condition that just caused his heart to stop working. Otherwise, he seemed perfectly healthy. He was married with a 9-month-old baby. So the funeral was in Sarnia. His wife was from Sarnia. He was from London, but his family agreed to have the funeral here in Sarnia. His wife had she was from a large Italian family, and when I met with them, they said, we don't want a religious ceremony. We want to honor Jim's life, and that's what we did, and it went very well. They were all raised Catholic. They said we don't want a religious service because they had had a bad experience a few years earlier when the widow's sister and her husband had premature twins, and they died soon after birth. And they told me when they went to the priest for counseling that it was horrible, that he was insensitive and cruel, and they said, we are leaving the church, we never want to go back. So as well as not doing funeral services well, clergy, despite what we may think, are not really trained in counselling. And neither are we as lay chaplains. And that was emphasized to me when I did my training. They said, under no circumstances can you provide counselling, because I'm not a trained counsellor. So anyway, that funeral went well. It went so well that his wife called me a few months later and said, Allan, I'd like you to have a child dedication ceremony for my baby in Canatera Park in July. And we did that service, dedicate Isabella, 9-month-old baby, in Canatera Park. So a child dedication ceremony is typically a non-religious baby naming ceremony where the family and friends come together. They dedicate themselves to the welfare of the child, and it's just a beautiful ceremony. And during the ceremony, when she was holding her baby, and I mentioned her dad not being there, but he was with us in spirit, Isabella looked up at the sky and pointed her finger. It was just amazing. After that ceremony, they had a picnic and they taught me how to play bocce. And then a couple of years later, I also did a wedding for that family. So what a wonderful start to my career as a lay chaplain. And so that year, that was in January 2004, that year I did 17 more funeral and memorial services. The most challenging services to do, of course, are for young people, those who have died accidentally or taken their own lives. It's so challenging to go into a home where a young person has taken their life to meet with the family. The family, of course, is traumatized. And just something I became conscious of is that you got to be careful with your language, because it is no longer acceptable to say that someone has committed suicide. I always say they took their own life, or it's also acceptable to say that they completed suicide. They completed suicide. I prefer to say they took their own life. But to say to a family that someone committed suicide can be very hurtful, because they know that committing suicide used to be a crime. And so that's, you commit a crime, you commit suicide. The two were linked at one time. So be very careful on what language you use. So just to finish off, the smallest funeral I did and the largest funeral I did. The smallest funeral I did was for a woman who lived all alone. She was blind. She only had one daughter, and she was estranged from her daughter. They hadn't spoken in many years. The funeral director thought that we should have a service for her in the hope that her daughter would come and reconcile in death. But she didn't. And the only person present at the funeral was one person, her neighbor. So sad. The largest funeral I did was for Gary Kendall. Gary Kendall was a volunteer firefighter in Point Edward, who you may remember drowned in a training accident under the bridge when he got trapped under an ice floe and they couldn't get him out in time. Gary was married with 3 children, 2 teenagers and a daughter in her early 20s. Gary's wife told me that Gary would not want a church funeral, and so it was held at the Holiday Inn. There were over 1,000 people there, well over 1,000. And of course, there were officials from the fire department, provincial, local, and they have certain rituals that they have to go through during the funeral, so I had to coordinate that with them. But it was very moving. And even though Gary himself was non-religious, the family asked that I include a prayer. His brother wanted Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, and his daughter wanted a musical version of Abide With Me played. And so that's an important point. Although the person may be an atheist, a humanist, non-religious, those who are attending, you have to meet their needs as well. So the funeral is for the living, right? It's for those who remain and who are grieving. So whatever they want, that's my philosophy. So I've had many, many challenges and experiences when it comes to funeral and memorial services. As you can imagine, people die in all sorts of ways, and some of them can be very tragic, of course. But my time as a lay chaplain was a wonderful personal journey, one that I am and always will be grateful for. It was spiritually enriching and humbling. I learned about the joys and challenges, the successes and failures of so many people. It was joyful to provide couples with a marriage ceremony that honored their wishes, to celebrate the love and commitment they were making to each other on their wedding day. And it was very interesting to compare weddings and funerals in terms of what they wanted. Because I would say maybe, although a lot of people I did funeral memorial services for were non-religious, some of their family members were. And I would say maybe 90% of the funerals I did, the families wanted, a prayer or a reading included. However, when it came to weddings, I would say 95% of the couples wanted non-religious wedding ceremonies. Only a small handful wanted, a prayer or a reading. So very interesting. It was inspiring and humbling to walk with families in their time of loss and sorrow. And those experiences also provided me with a deeper appreciation for this fragile gift of life, one which we know can end at any time. So key points: lay chaplaincy by the CUC. We were pioneers, we led the way. Same-sex marriage, we offered same-sex marriage when it became legal, we led the way. Celebrancy, non-traditional funerals, we led the way. Words matter, that's a key point. And I'll just end by saying, lay chaplaincy, you've heard how much it means to me, how much it means to the community. So maybe you will consider taking up the challenge so that Steve has some company. So thank you all. Steve, we can have our closing song now.
Recording stopped.